Records rebut claims of unequal treatment of January 6 rioters. It's a common refrain from some of those charged in the January 6 riot at the U.S. Capitol and their Republican allies. The Justice Department is treating them harshly because of their political views, while those arrested during last year's protests over racial injustice were given leniency. Court records tell a different story. An Associated Press review of court documents in more than 300 federal cases stemming from the protests sparked by George Floyd's death last year shows that dozens of people charged have been convicted of serious crimes and sent to prison. The dissonance between the rhetoric of Capitol rioters and their supporters and the record established by courts highlights both the racial tension inherent in their arguments. The pro-Donald Trump rioters were largely white and last summer's protesters were more diverse, and the flawed assessment at the heart of their claims, the property damage or accusations of arson and looting from last year. Those were serious and they were dealt with seriously, but they weren't an attack on the very core constitutional processes that we rely on in a democracy, nor were they an attack on the United States Congress, said Kent Greenfield, a professor at Boston College Law School. To be sure, some defendants have received lenient deals. In Portland, Oregon, where demonstrations, many turning violent, occurred nightly for months after a white Minneapolis police officer killed Floyd, about 60 of the roughly 100 cases that were brought have been dismissed. Court records show most of those defendants received deferred resolution agreements, under which prosecutors promise to drop charges after a certain amount of time if the defendant stays out of trouble and completes things like community service. Some January 6 defendants have complained it's unfair they aren't getting the same deals.
But President Joe Biden's Justice Department has continued the vast majority of the racial injustice protest cases brought across the U.S. under Trump and has often pushed for lengthy prison time for people convicted of serious crimes. Since Biden took office in January, federal prosecutors have brought some new cases stemming from last year's protests. Conservatives have sought to equate the attack on the Capitol with the Black Lives Matter protests, accusing Democrats of being hypocrites for not denouncing the violence after Floyd's death as loudly as the January 6 insurrection. And some Republicans have seized on the handling of the protest cases in Portland to suggest that the January 6 defendants are being politically persecuted. That has not been borne out when comparing the sentences that federal judges have given to January 6 defendants and those who are accused of crimes during the protests against police brutality across the country. Only a handful of the nearly 600 people who've been charged in the insurrection have received their punishments so far, and just 3 people have been sentenced to time behind bars. The vast majority of the most serious cases, involving those accused of assaulting police officers or conspiring to block the certification of Biden's victory, remain unresolved. The catalysts for the riot and the demonstrations for racial justice were also fundamentally different. The mob of Trump supporters, whipped up by the former president's lies about the election, descended on the Capitol and pushed past police barriers, assaulted officers, smashed windows, and sent lawmakers running in a stunning attempt to overturn the presidential election. The demonstrations after Floyd's death were largely peaceful calls to address racial inequality and police brutality that occasionally turned violent. In some cities, protests descended into chaos after dark, with people smashing windows, looting stores, setting fires, and assaulting officers. William Barr, who as Attorney General led the Justice Department last year under Trump, pushed federal prosecutors to aggressively go after protesters who caused violence. Defense lawyers complained that many of the cases belonged in state court, punishments are typically lighter there, and accused Justice Department officials of carrying out a politically motivated effort to stymie the demonstrations. Just this month, a man was sentenced to 4 years behind bars and ordered to pay what his attorney said is likely to exceed $1.5 million in restitution after pleading guilty to inciting a riot last spring in Champaign, Illinois. Shamar Betts, who was 19 at the time, posted a flyer on Facebook on May 31, 2020, that said "Riot at Marketplace Mall at 3 p.m. and instructed people to bring friends and family, posters, bricks, book bags, etc. He participated in the looting, went live on Facebook during the riot and bragged about starting it, authorities said. More than 70 stores were looted, and the riot cost $1.8 million in damage, prosecutors said. Betts' lawyer, Elizabeth Pollock, said Betts was frustrated about police brutality across the U.S., had lost his job because of the coronavirus outbreak and never intended to hurt anyone. Prosecutors pushed for the maximum punishment of 5 years in prison and the maximum restitution amount for Betts, who had no criminal history, she said. They took into account not a single mitigating factor, nothing about how he grew up, nothing about how the George Floyd protests had affected the community, nothing about how the pandemic had affected Shamar personally and the community. There was absolutely no quarter given to him at all, his attorney said in an interview. In another case this month, an Illinois man was sentenced to nearly 9 years behind bars for lighting a Minneapolis cell phone store on fire in June 2020. A Charleston, South Carolina man who live-streamed himself looting a store downtown was sentenced to 2 years in prison. In the Capitol riot, dozens of defendants have been charged only with misdemeanors, and a standard plea deal has allowed many to plead guilty to a single count of demonstrating in the Capitol. In Indiana, a woman who admitted illegally entering the Capitol but didn't participate in any violence or destruction avoided jail time, and 2 other misdemeanor defendants got 1 and 2 months of home confinement. 2 other people who were locked up pre-trial were released after pleading guilty to misdemeanors and serving the maximum 6-month jail sentence. Only 1 defendant convicted of a felony has received his punishment so far. Paul Hodgkins, who breached the U.S. Senate chamber carrying a Trump campaign flag, was ordered to serve 8 months behind bars. The political fighting over the cases comes as some Republicans in Washington have tried to downplay the attack on the Capitol, with many of them portraying the siege as a mostly peaceful protest despite the shocking violence that unfolded on live TV.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe